Hey, I'm Craig Newmark. American democracy is under threat, and we all need to work together to protect the country and to protect our democracy. It's kind of like in World War II, when everyone was expected to play a role, and the first part of this is for all of us to learn a little more and to work together, strengthening American democracy, strengthening the country. The Civic Life series is a big part of that, and the 92nd Street Y, New York, is the right forum for delivering all that. I appreciate your joining me. Thanks.
Hey, everybody, I'm John Avlon. Welcome to the 92nd Street Y. We've got a great conversation ahead with Tina Nguyen, the author of the awesome new book, The MAGA Diaries. It is part memoir. It is part travelogue through the recesses of the far right from a journalistic standpoint. Tina, congratulations on the publication of the book. It's great to see you.
Great to see you too, and thank you so much. Can't wait. Let's go.
My pleasure. No, there's a lot to cover. You're kind of like the Zelig of this era to some extent. I mean, you're popping up in a lot of different journalistic outfits, digital outfits, but also your own trajectory from Milton Academy to Claremont, which we'll get to sort of having a front row seat at the early days of the Daily Caller and the movement that became MAGA. It's kind of extraordinary. I mean, the personalities you brush up against. I guess just as a framing question, how surreal is it to look back on your relatively young life and see how many of the anti-heroes of our time that you have gotten to know personally?
Honestly, it's been weird being a 34-year-old who's written a memoir, but when I look back at everything, I'm just thinking, okay, I made a lot of weird decisions as a child. I decided that this was a way I wanted to live my life. And one of the themes I keep hitting on in the book is how the lack of opportunity and the drive for doing whatever it takes to get there ended up motivating a lot of my decisions and a lot of what I ended up writing. And I think partially it reflects the desperate state of our civic institutions that these were the moves that I made. Not to be, actually, no, that was extremely grandiose of myself, but my life's weird. We're going to go with it.
All lives are weird, especially up close. I think Joe Walsh once said, I may be giving Joe Walsh, the former Eagles guitarist, too much credit here, but that life makes no sense when lived forward, but when looking back, it seems like a carefully plotted novel. You began as a young conservative at Milton Academy, an unusual thing to be, gravitated toward Claremont McKenna College, which has a very important role within the conservative firmament. Describe how you found yourself to be identifying as a campus conservative in high school.
I was one of those people who both disliked the Iraq War, but then also realized that there was a certain type of person who had more than others. And when you're really young like that, you don't particularly understand the dynamics behind all of it. You've just got your little baby brain going, oh, this is why they have it. And I mean, as a woman of color and a scholarship kid, I too also benefited from this, but this was not something that was front and center because I was not doing as well as my classmates. And when you run into another young conservative, my ex-boyfriend who ended up introduced me to the Claremont world, who's like, I also have that same grievance as you, but look at me, I'm working hard, I'm succeeding. I got an internship, a job as a research assistant for Alan Dershowitz. Look at me, I'm on my way up. And I don't know anything about, connections in American society because my parents are refugees. I see this and I'm like, oh my God, I can do it too. Meritocracy is real. A very specific type of meritocracy, but it's so real.
Well, I mean, there certainly are opportunities provided. I mean, one of the many bold-faced names you just mentioned, yeah, the Alan Dershowitz segue in the book, where your boyfriend then Chuck Johnson, who we will get to, because he did play sort of a notorious role in a certain realm tributary of conservative digital politics. Claremont McKenna is another interesting one, and it's interesting to me because it was founded, and I think at the point you became involved, was very associated with intellectual. There's Straussians and a great deal of reverence for Lincoln, which I share, and the founders and those ideals. And yet Claremont, somewhat absurdly and I think sinisterly, has turned into sort of an intellectual hub of secession aficionados and people who John Eastman involved in January 6th. I mean, the Lincoln tradition, which is let's hold together the Union, and the founders' belief in emphasizing national unity. And I'm speaking as a slightly biased, Lincoln and Washington biographer. Claremont seems to have gotten on a decidedly different trajectory than its founding principles. I wonder how you see your both time there and how it's evolved.
When I first started there, the Claremont Institute had taken those principles, and I think the motto is preserving the ideals of the American founding, and had applied it pretty heavily to the popular Republican mood of the day, which was empire, taking the American ideals, not negotiating with terrorists, like implementing our vision of democracy abroad. The populist backlash was like, absolutely not, let's not do this. But at the core of Straussianism is this idea that there is a specific reading and understanding of the seminal texts about Western civilization that you only get if you're a really smart person who understands the context and history around the way these guys lived, and that these guys are like the best way to do government and society and ethics. The East Coast are like, okay, let's just limit it to the ancient Greeks and the Romans, maybe a little bit of like the Catholic thinkers and theologians. And then the West Coast Straussians were like, let's add the founders to it, maybe. And
which is great, I mean, in principle, but my personal.
In principle, yeah. But the thing is, when you have a living society that is ostensibly based on those founders, the way that you interpret those texts can really change over time based on your existence in the, greater arc of history. I remember the moment that everyone in conservative world started freaking out about the Claremont Institute was when Michael Anton, who eventually became a Trump speechwriter, wrote this essay called The Flight 93 Election. And the idea was, oh no, we need to use the values of American society are being encroached upon by immigrants and minorities and all these folks who want to destroy the American way of life, progressives, yada, yada, yada. So what we need to do is go hard into Trumpism. And the majority of conservatives were like, oh my God, how dare you? But the moment you read more into Anton's back catalog, as it were, of articles, I think he teaches at Hillsdale now, which is another really Straussian college. But he was writing for the Claremont Review of Books, and his articles were all things like Machiavelli predicted the fall of society by saying that morals should not be instituted here. California is turning into a hell pit because of all of these liberal ideas that are encroaching upon the ideal that the founders set out for us. And more and more and more and more, the Claremont Institute fell into this end of civilization is upon us mindset. If you're really desperate about preserving a specific way of life, then you can take Straussianism and be like, actually, I know what the founders would have done in this situation.
I want to press on that point because I knew Michael Anton a little bit once upon a time, and he was very preoccupied with wearing suits and Strauss, and but this evolution, like Rudy Giuliani's, is a bit unexpected. And how do you think that those folks? I'm not going to ask you to get in any individual's head, but the institution, as you understand it, has evolved, is applying founding principles or Lincoln's principles, right? Who's preeminently trying to keep a nation united while evolving, and say it leads them to advocate extreme measures, shall we say, from the so-called Red Caesarism scenario to really focusing on calls a 9/11 comparisons. Like you gotta rush the cockpit and risk taking the whole country down, which is an odious comparison, obviously.
I think there's a difference in the way that Claremont approaches the mechanisms of government and the balance of powers versus the moral and ethical values of the citizen themselves. And the moment that they see liberal, quote unquote, institutions extending their beliefs into everyday American life, that's when they start freaking out and going, wait, would the founders have wanted this? Would the founders have been okay with the rejection of religion in everyday American life? Let's go into schools, let's go into activism, let's start even expanding into media. The Daily Wire, for instance, was connected to Claremont, to Andrew Breitbart, to all of these like Hollywood groups that were, let's try to put conservative ideals into entertainment. The easy way to describe it would be culture war, but the way that the Claremont Institute view of the world takes this moment is the very foundations of American society are coming apart at the bottom. We need to use government to preserve that.
But taking dramatic action that would not typically be considered conservative lowercase c or Republican lowercase r, correct?
Yes, that's true. At the same time, the conservative movement was founded on the belief that there was an external power trying to destroy the American way of life. Not just destroy the American way of life. Edmund Burke, I think, is one of the big intellectual pillars of any sort of conservatism. And just to boil it down to a really, really probably aggressively pithy statement, it's you don't want society to move forward too quickly, otherwise it will just come apart at the seams. And the Burkean view is, okay, we got to drag it back as far as possible, even if it means preserving institutions that are unjust. We just don't want to do a French Revolution.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess I have a more moderate view of Burke. I mean, the irony, of course, in the wake of January 6th is that the conservative movement, if you date it to Burke, as you did, and I think appropriately so, a lot of things are in reaction to the excesses of the French Revolution. And the founders, I think, understanding that anarchy is the quickest path to tyranny, but there is therefore a middle ground that should be pursued. And what's different about what we're dealing with now is that the middle ground is itself demonized, right? I mean, this isn't about moderate progress. It's an extreme form of reactionaryism, which you actually quote individuals in the book as proudly owning that term. I guess one way to tie this all together in your book that I found fascinating, and this is one of the points you make in your introduction, which is sort of the promise of the book, is your career arc, in part until you left conservative media, showed what a concerted effort is being made at the grassroots, recruiting students, young journalists, to be soldiers of this movement, and the way that makes people be co-opted. This is a quote from your introduction. Missing in their work is something a journalist looking from the outside world never quite understood. The way the conservative movement makes itself immortal, turning idealism, friendship, ambition into the same thing. It draws in young people with promises of stability, purpose, and career summer seminars full of new like-minded friends. It invites them into a world of power, full of eager mentors and cocktail hours who want to help them mature and grow. It gives the most promising kids internships and research projects to fill out their resume. Their loyalty becomes organic, their ideas similar, and eventually those young people occupy positions of power. Like my ex-boyfriend who became a hatchet man for Peter Thiel and introducing the billionaire to white supremacists, or my old boss who became, for a time, the most hated and popular man on Fox News, or one woman who was at a seminar my friend attended who became a federal judge, repealing mask mandates at the tender age of 33. I was fascinated in that because it implies a lot more organization and concrete funding to sort of co-opt levers of power in a way that I think your book kind of pulls the curtain back on.
That was one of the things that I sort of leaned on when I started reporting on the right, and I wouldn't say leaned on so much as like accidentally discovered. Everyone I knew in that world had at one point been either friendly to me or even a friend of mine, or just someone who I could be like, oh yeah, I heard about that thing. Did you know so and so? And they're like, oh my God, yeah. And I was like, did you hear about the thing that always happened there? And they're like, oh yeah. Uh, but it's a social circle that is so powerful that the moment that you start being a little bit critical of it, people get really defensive about it. And the idea that that once you were a friend and then you start questioning the reason that you became friends in the first place, that like foundation, not just a foundation, but that summer camp you went to and became friends over, that's the moment that people start like feeling a ton of internal emotional conflict, and what they do with that conflict is like really up to them. um I know I'm showing my hand here as a journalist, but I also feel a lot of emotional conflict whenever I cover this beat, because I'm like, these guys raised me kind of, and just the act of being outside looking in feels like a betrayal of that.
Well,
um
to your point, I mean, I think this is they're seeding tribalism. In which case, I think we've seen people put their loyalty to that particular tribe ahead of their loyalty even to the Constitution, which was allegedly the purpose of the creation of the tribe in the first place.
mm. Yeah, at the same time, the
If you
moment
think
that
that's
you
fair,
no,
tell me
no,
if
I
you.
think I think that's fair. Tribalism, I think, is a very uh I think reductive way to put it. But it's a calculus once your values start clashing with your social circle. And when you don't really think about that as a dynamic, all you're thinking about is like, oh my God, if I like criticize someone here, I will lose my social circle. I will lose the way I make money. I will lose the ability to provide for my children. I feel like I can't leave this world in order to do something else, which I think is the crux of the problem happening right now. It's that like if you're a professional Republican, you have to do a lot of like either public flagellation or resume cleansing in order to make yourself quote unquote acceptable to mainstream society as like a politician, or in my case, a journalist. Like when I was applying for Vanity Fair, I was told by multiple people to take the Daily Caller off my resume. And I don't know whether I would have been let through the HR filters if they had it on there.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Daily Caller, because I was going to go there next, because it's fascinating on a number of levels. First of all, you describe in a chapter you entering the world of the Daily Caller. It's in its infancy, and it's a very different Tucker Carlson than the one most Americans got to know under Trump and on Fox News. He is personable. He is collegial. He is broadly well-liked and respected, no less conservative, but kind of a P.G. O'Rourke-esque libertarian conservative. And the environment he's creating has individuals like Matt Labash and Matt Lewis, and there's reporting, but there are a couple of Democrats in there. And it's kind of the idea that it's going to be a center-right counterweight to the Huffington Post. You know, that had a liveliness to it. I was running the Daily Beast around the same time. But then things started to change, and your account of that place is pretty extraordinary, in part because in your relatively brief time there, I guess, not only did you get to know Tucker, but you seem to get put on a beat that was being influenced by PR, not just partisan interest, but like PR and financial interest was my takeaway. Like they were being steered towards coverage of certain areas that pursued certain interests, aims, and it made you uncomfortable. Tell about that.
Right. So the reason I got to the Daily Caller in the first place was not that I had knocked on the door and said, please give me a job. It was that back in my college days, I took this internship program that was like looped in through the Koch network, this thing at George Mason University called the Institute for Humane Studies. And once I did that summer internship, I got invited to the formal mentorship program where the guy who ran the program was like, I am here to help you in your career. I'm going to like look over your resume. I'm going to connect you to people who I know in my network who are looking for jobs. And the caller was one of those people, and that the caller was brought to me by John Elliott through a guy he knew named John Hankey, who was hiring for the caller, or at least the way it was presented to me was helping the caller try to find someone. And the interview was very like, all right, I want to do some muckraking on things that are happening in tech. Let me help you out here. And I was like, okay, cool, let's do this. The more that I was there, though, the more I realized that like the man who had connected me to the caller for this job was trying to like really, really push my coverage in a direction that felt like not just off, but like anti-libertarian in its way. For instance, the big story of the summer in tech was the attempted acquisition of T-Mobile by AT&T, which meant the antitrust guys came in, and monopolies are inherently not libertarian in nature. But then everyone he was connecting me to was like, oh no, the DOJ is awful. They shouldn't prevent this merger. Like, here's why the reasons are awful. And I'm just going like, this is weird. But I just kept getting pushback and pushback and pushback from the man who I had considered my like benefactor, that I started going, wait, this is really weird. I go to my editors. I'm like, hey, what's going on here? Then like a couple of weeks later, like actually fairly shortly after, I get the, oh, we're really sorry, this isn't working out. Here's some money. Go away.
Well, I mean, asking questions about the direction in which you're being pressured to cover something contrary to the alleged philosophical underpinnings you've been hired for. I mean, that sounds like someone was trying to get coverage to benefit their financial interests, not their ideological interests. Is that fair?
Honestly, I was a baby 22-year-old at the time. I can only speculate as to the reasons, and speculation is like, I don't know, fairly irresponsible. I just laid out the fact pattern as I experienced it.
Right.
And it's just overall kind of sketchy and eyebrow raising, but that's exactly the sequence of events that I experienced.
Now, John Elliott, you mentioned his name, and there's a big reveal at the end of the book about John Elliott. Tell us about John Elliott's arc.
He was the mentor I just mentioned. Really sweet guy up front. And he had been looking specifically for ideologically minded high schoolers, college students to come to this journalism program that he put together. And the odd thing was that when I got there, he told me that my application cited the, I don't know, he told me that my application had the right answer, quote unquote. And I was like, what does that mean? And he told me that all these Harvard students had answered with Oprah and Bill Gates for the question of what's your greatest intellectual inspiration? And my mind just skips over how weird it was that there was a right answer and goes, oh my God, I beat out Harvard students. My mom's going to be so proud. Very Asian mother. Then as time goes on and he's pushing me in these directions that are more and more ideologically sketchy, beyond the caller even. I think he threw 3 or 4 job opportunities my way that I turned down. It just became clear that there was a specific ideology that he was pushing through the guise of journalism, but it was, 2011 at this point. All these newsrooms were virtually collapsing, and getting any sort of paid job in media was ridiculously hard. So even after I left the world of conservative journalism, I still stayed somewhat in touch with him. It is quite a privilege to be in a position where you don't have to worry about where your next job's going to be, although who knows if that'll ever change. But fast forward to about 2019 or so, and I'm at Vanity Fair. I open up this article and it just says John Elliott was part, if not the heart of this white nationalist email server full of journalists and conservative media, where they were all brainstorming ways to put their ideology in editorial pages and editorial coverage, just like sneaking it in there. The thing was literally called Morning Hate, and he would be making jokes about Hitler and how like Trump was quote unquote Hitler's friend. And the gist of the entire group was, we're trying to find ways to eventually make our vision a reality. We wouldn't be able to do that without the internet, but we have to be quiet about it. And I'm just thinking, oh my God, like he was looking for people in my groups to join this. This is insane.
I mean, you're kind of almost glossing over the Hitler references and the connections and the self-identification as white nationalists. I mean, the conservative journalists were on this listserv were praising Hitler and self-identifying as white nationalists is stunning. It's revolting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he never was like that around anyone who went through that group, except for the people who he saw as sympathetic. Like, I would say there were so many good journalists that came out of the IHS program. Lachlan Markay, I think, Rachel Beatty, who writes Playbook, was actually in my cohort that year. But also the next year, there was this writer named Katie McHugh, who listed this paleoconservative guy named Joe Sobran as an intellectual influence. And there's this big BuzzFeed report about her exit from the movement, and she cited this email that he'd sent her, saying that he wanted to interview her for the internship, where he was like, "You are the only person who's ever listed Joe Sobran as a reference. He was a friend of mine." And the more that she just demonstrated that, yeah, she's totally into like pretty backwards beliefs, the more that John was thinking, oh my God, she's cool. I'm going to introduce her to all of these influential white nationalists, and I'm going to help her while she's getting cultivated there, get a job at these other locations. And when I was describing it to someone later, he described it as sifting for zealots.
Yep. Sifting for zealots.
It was a really good phrase. I keep using it whenever I talk about this incident. And I honestly can't imagine that the rest of the movement is like this too.
Well, you know, and you raise an interesting point, which is there are some folks who came up in the, early 2000s, broadly speaking, yourself, Kurt Bardella, Katie, people who left the movement, Lachlan Markay, people who are excellent journalists, and they have a center-right background. And I think that helps their perspective in some cases. But they parted ways with their fellow travelers, and I'm using the term ironically, but intentionally, who continued to drift towards Trumpism and rationalizing January 6th and all this other stuff. One of the points you make in the book is that, and I think part because of your experience, you see, I think you use a metaphor about the left piloting a plane towards a mountain. Like they just can't get out of their own way, so to speak. I wonder what you think the blind spots that exist that have made the left not be able to see Trump coming. You first predicted he'd win to your editor the general election, and he sort of scoffed at that. And then maybe underestimate the current challenge we face as a country.
I have found that progressives have taken the idea that history, the arc of history, is long but bends towards justice a little too seriously. The idea that one president who gets elected would meet who is Black and certainly not a white man, and definitely not a guy who would block Mexicans at the border. The fact that he gets elected is like, oh my God, something fundamentally a shift in the Americans' conscious. Everyone's going to be going forward now. It'll be great forever. There is no willingness to accept that that people will sometimes want to go backwards. And if a person makes a really good case, an emotionally compelling case that they should move backwards and, make America great again, people will go that way. Progressives particularly want the future to happen now. and they don't particularly think that they don't particularly think that there is like compromises that one has to make or trade-offs or accepting a little bit of like a small victory. I interview AOC in 2018 right after she gets elected, and the conversation is in the book, and she is just so hell-bent on making sure that that the progressive position going into negotiations is here's where we need to be, here's where we're staying, and we only accept this. And the purity that that position implies just sort of like ignores political reality. Like, for instance, John Fetterman right now declaring that he's pro-Israel is like pissing off progressives left and right, but he is also the senator from Pennsylvania who represents an entire constituency, including Republicans, who will see him like, they'll kick him out of office for sure if he decides to like offer a modicum of aid to Gazans. There's a vision that they want, and they so desperately want it, that there is just no way they'll ever let go of it without feeling like they've betrayed their own morals.
Yeah, and obviously there's a continuity. Look, we have asymmetric polarization in this country. That's a fancy way of saying the far right's much further right than the far left is politically influential. But you know, I think what you're speaking to is sort of a sense that every election is a potential Armageddon, and that, you know, compromise and moderation are virtues towards forming a more perfect union, that is discarded in the face of sort of an ideological absolutism and intolerance. One of the things that I think your experience and your network, your source network gave you was an early sense that something was about to go really sideways. I want you to talk about the Stop the Steal movement. You'd known Ali Alexander for years. And how, you know, some people were caught flat-footed by January 6th, but you weren't, in your experience of that day, given everything you know and who you knew.
Right.
Big question there.
Oh yeah. I think the first moment I knew that something was really off was actually in 2018 when Mike Cernovich, who at that point was sort of one of the first MAGA gonzo journalists able to take down a couple of really big Democrats, but then also prone to getting it wrong again, like horrifically wrong, was throwing this event in Midtown Manhattan at a Hell's Kitchen nightclub. And not only is Ali Alexander there, Will Chamberlain's there, Cassandra Fairbanks, all of these online personalities, but then there are also Groypers. Actually, I'm not sure if Groypers are there, strike that. Then there are also Proud Boys and people who are obsessed with Stefan Molyneux and all of these like really toxic masculinity types. And even though they were told not to wear insignia, the Proud Boys just showed up anyways in their polos and yellow, their black polos with yellow stripes. And I was like, why are these guys all together in one room? This is weird. I got to keep this in the back of my mind. Throughout the entire summer leading up to it, there was a surge in the prominence and wider acceptance of both the Proud Boys and the militia movement, primarily because of the government shutdowns due to COVID. There's no businesses, there's no restaurant, there's no school, there's no church. All of a sudden, Black Lives Matter protests start spilling into the streets. The reaction to the message that we need to defund the cops just hit a giant nerve among these groups, because the Proud Boys are street brawlers and they believe that they're there to protect American citizens from being harassed or beaten up by BLM or Antifa. Their words, not mine. The militia theory, Stuart Rhodes, Oath Keepers, 3%ers, what have you, their belief is the federal government wants to take over individual states and lock us down into a fascist autocracy. We are there as sovereign citizens to help the police maintain law and order. We have a constitutional right to do this, and whatever it takes to prevents a tyrannical government from holding power, we will do. And they gain more and more momentum over the summer. And once the election gets called and all of these ballots start getting counted, and it takes a long time because there's so many mail-in ballots in these 5 states that are super close, the internet people start going, oh my God, is there a steal? Let's go check this out and start live streaming it. The Proud Boys and the militia guys start
before the
showing up.
election. I want to highlight that for folks. This
Yes.
is preemptive.
This entire everything leading up to this point is before the election. November 2020 rolls around. Ballots are still being counted. It's kind of slow and no one's quite sure who won Arizona or not. So the internet guys start going to these polling places and start live streaming and getting photos of people who are just trying to do their jobs. The Proud Boys come in to harass and intimidate these ballot counters and lawmakers and whatever. The militia guys come in with their guns, and the members of these groups start appearing on OAN. Alex Jones, literally Stewart's Rhodes, is there calling on Americans to descend upon the Capitol. There are all these caravans being organized from around the country to congregate on January 6th in the Capitol. And I'm just thinking, oh no, okay, all of these very violent actors are all going to the Capitol at a specific time. They believe that the government is stealing their power and the election, and there is a very specific theory that they want to make happen. And then, at that point, I just pitch, I want to go to the Capitol on January 6th and interview people who are there to harass lawmakers into voting to give the election to Trump.
I mean, not just the fact you saw it coming, but the fact that these groups that felt they were being called to stop a unconstitutional usurpation of power ended up participating in an attempted unconstitutional usurpation of power is such a disgusting irony that somehow it's so big it gets glossed over a bit. There are, then there's the larger irony, of course, that the conservative movement, the conservatism as we understand it, begins with the resistance against violent mobs trying to topple official proceedings and buildings. And for an incarnation, there's nothing conservative about it. It's mimicking work complained about.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. It's being memory holed right now. Are
you surprised at the success to which they've memory hold it?
Not really. The reactionaries are primarily online, and they have way more hold over the conservative conscience than Fox News currently does, and possibly ever did. There's this concept I bring up in the book called the infinite fringe. And basically the idea is that prior to the internet, there were a few media institutions that dictated what was and was not conservative, and they were powerful and had widespread influence, but that's because they had broadcast and giant print media subscriptions. So the moment that there was someone in that group who did something that was quote unquote not conservative, they'd be kicked out of the group and maybe get a ham radio in the woods to spread their beliefs, but that would basically be it. The moment though that these media outlets move online, they have instantaneous reach to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And if you get kicked out of that group, there's nothing stopping you from taking your audience and going elsewhere. And if someone in that group gets kicked out, they can keep going and they can keep going and they can keep going and so on and so on and so on. There is no hold or consensus of what is conservative anymore. And at that point, your option is either go along with it or find yourself condemned to irrelevance.
Well, I mean, that's a cult tactic. I mean, the contravailing force should be historically Madison's Fed 10, where if you get too fringy, you lose your ability to determine democratic outcomes within majoritarian elections. But given that, are you surprised that after, forget 2016 and even 2020, but after we saw the ex-president trying to overturn an election on the basis of a lie that led to an attack on the Capitol, that a party who's now been indicted on 91 counts, that a party that was ostensibly dedicated to patriotism, conservatism, law and order, seems to have fallen back into his throes so completely by embracing those lies. Did that surprise you, or did it seem inevitable to you, given everything you know?
It sort of did surprise me, but also because I may have given Ron DeSantis a little too much credit going into this election. I'm not going to lie. What he was pitching to the public, and I think it was very seductive to the conservative movement overall, was a guy who would take these fears they had of the cultural Marxism, for lack of a better phrase, and not only rein it in, but also use the rule of law to do so. And the Heritage Foundation, for instance, put together this playbook for a new Republican administration called Project 2025, where they were identifying candidates who would be good in a federal administration and what they would do on day one. But the thing is that they announced this project at an event that DeSantis was speaking at. The Trump way of going about things, however, is, nope, we don't like the Constitution. We don't like precedent. We're just kind of going to go with our gut. And Trumpists, their position is always like post hoc of backwards justifying exactly what he did. However, when it became really clear that DeSantis just could not pull it off, I think that's when everyone went back to Trump, because either you have someone who represented the old way of things like Nikki Haley, or you had someone who still had the massive popularity and populist instinct of Trump, who was going to be absorbing DeSantis's voters no matter what. And like the DeSantis voter is literally like, I like what Trump brought to America, but I hate his drama. DeSantis will do it better and more calmly.
Right. The problem, the promise of competence without sacrificing ideology. So one of the things in the opening scene, you talk about some actual Nazis showing up at the DeSantis rally with the event hosted by Heritage. You mentioned that one of your mentors on the Morning Hate is calling Adolf Hitler by, I believe, the code "our friend," and then associating Donald Trump with Adolf Hitler. Your ex-boyfriend, who was a very influential person in conservative internet circles a decade or so ago, your last interaction with him, he has descended into what can only be described as sort of a sea of anti-Semitism. There's the coded anti-Semitism of QAnon, many of those tropes. I've always been of the opinion that, calling people Nazis is basically an admission of defeat in your argumentative abilities. But we run into a problem where people are calling themselves Nazis or invoking Nazis or embracing anti-Semitism. And I wonder how you see, with your perspective, that strain. Certainly we see anti-Semitism on the far left, particularly in reaction to the horrific terrorist attacks. There's a horseshoe theory going on here. But also with regard to what you're seeing in the right, because it seems it's getting mainstreamed in a way that I don't think we should turn a blind eye to, within the infinite fringe as it populates people in positions of power, particularly on the right, it seems.
Yeah, I think from what I've observed so far, the anti-Semitic strain is largely connected to a very specific vision of liberal elitism and where it comes from. The blog post you're referencing from my ex-boyfriend literally goes into this idea that Harvard and all of these institutions that used to prioritize the WASP meritocracy were taken over by quote unquote Eastern European Jewry. The previous Trump administration was the reason that like a lot of let me dial that back a little bit. Nazis and white supremacists and white nationalists were able to pin all of the failures of the Trump administration on Jared Kushner and be like, oh my God, this guy is implementing the Jewish agenda. Right now, another popular theory is that like Eastern European Jewry is infiltrating these other institutions like Harvard, Yale, corporate America, the media. And
this is what the Soros stuff is about too, obviously.
This is exactly, absolutely. And it's the same type of anti-Semitism, obviously, that led to the rise of Nazism for sure. It just is like extremely tailored to modern times. And if you present that to a normal, like a normie kind of MAGA, but not really an aggressive bully conservative, the idea, the premise that it is because they are like inherently Jewish is probably not going to fly with them. But the idea that it is a very specific, like cosmopolitan elite, I believe that's the actual phrase used in the past, will resonate with them. And I don't know exactly how far it will go, but in the consciousness right now, there's this belief that like, no, actual Nazis don't exist. But here's like the argument that kind of is sympathetic to them. Like that, the story that you mentioned about me running into these Nazis at Turning Point USA, I found like such a mind-blowing experience, not because there were Nazis that had shown up there, but the Nazis were there to literally troll the college students had shown up. And if you asked any of them, they'd be like, oh my God, no, I'm pro-Israel. I'm pro-Israel. I support the right of the Jewish state. Let's give Bibi Netanyahu all of the money. But they were looking at these guys and they thought they were not Nazis at all. They thought that they were maybe liberals who were dressed as Nazis to make them look bad, or maybe some group like the Lincoln Project who had sent Nazis. And like, since this was still the like height of COVID, these guys were still wearing masks, which just like inflamed their suspicions even more. And the entire time, everyone was just screaming at them, pull down your mask, let us see who you are. Get away from here, we don't want you. But the inability to recognize a Nazi for a Nazi, I think, is the defining characteristic of the type of anti-Semitism that you're seeing. Like, it's too much, the Nazis are a brand, not that we just don't like, and more, these ideas make sense to us. Let's forget about like the swastikas and whatever.
That's chilling, right? With any sort of historic perspective, that's chilling. I've got two final questions for you. I'm not asking you to pull out a crystal ball, but you know, historically, one of the comforts of history is that cults end, demagogues implode. We've never had a circumstance where a major political party would willingly renominate someone with this sort of associative baggage, let alone with the pledges that he is making about how what he would do as president in terms of remaking the government, mass deportations, et cetera. Is what you have learned give you confidence that we will work our way out of this? Or are you, given your knowledge, genuinely concerned about what lies ahead for our country?
The only way I think the MAGA movement would fracture is if Donald Trump did not designate a successor, and that successor had the same like rhetorical ability that he did. And the American public, throw all of the statistics you want at it, all of the data from the bureaus of whatever, still believe that their life under Trump, their individual daily life under Trump, was better than it was during the Biden administration. Prices were lower. They didn't go to Target and see flags all over the place. Their children did not go online and see like trans influencers. It is a scary moment for them. And the idea that someone will use the powers and levers of the executive government to bring them back to a time where they were not that terrified, that like, not only did they like, I was talking to one guy and I think he was like fairly like pretty skeptical against Trump, but the way that he viewed trans issues was like they are convincing our teenage girls to want to cut off their breasts. Like that is just so deeply personally frightening on a fundamental level to a lot of voters. And I think not understanding that will be the like ultimate blind spot to people who are concerned with upholding democratic norms. Like norms only exist so long as people consent to follow these rules, right? That's the basic government 101, the consent of the governed. If you convince enough people that that those rules are bad and they shouldn't follow them, like, would you be surprised if they decided not to? And that they'd be okay with it?
Well, and I think, this is the fear-fueled feedback loop, right? And that people create rationalizations and justifications for going along with things that might violate their alleged beliefs in the Constitution and democracy. And that brings me to my final question. You, but not only you mentioned Kurt Bardella, a handful of people who grew up in the conservative movement, but effectively got out once the real radicalism became apparent. Not just achieve mainstream jobs, because your foundation is your foundation. I wonder what you think, and looking back at people in Congress like Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney, very conservative people, David Frum, who you speak very kindly of in the book as someone who was a kindly person to you back in the Frum Forum days, who was drummed out of AEI. What do you think distinguishes those individuals who are conservatives but have broken ranks with Trump and Trumpism and that form of tribalism at personal and political cost? With the people who created rationalizations to keep going wherever it might end because it's to their personal and political benefit? What's the difference?
This is probably where the highly naive Ayn Rand part of my brain is kicking in and the Claremont part of my brain, but I always believe that people act in what they believe is their rational self-interest. Which sounds cynical as hell when I just put it like that, but like, hear me out. The ability to follow your beliefs is so dependent on whether you are able to support yourself financially, emotionally, if you feel like you have like some sort of way out and that you're not going to completely collapse. Maybe it's an issue of I cannot live if I continue going like this, which was, I think, kind of me. Or like David saying what it is that he believed in and then suddenly losing all of his status. And I mean, he had money, but he was really close to having to sell his father's art collection to like make sure that B was able to go to college, their daughter. The people who ended up becoming Trumpists either did it out of, I would say generously, either out of fear of losing their way of life, or because there was such a big financial incentive, a power incentive for them to become part of it. And I don't know if there's really a quote unquote true believer in Trumpism. A lot of Trumpism is just like following whatever it is that Trump says at any given moment and hoping for the best because it's Trump. But the calculus is always like, can I survive doing this? Or if I can't survive doing this, would I rather lose everything? Like, could I lose everything in order to pull this off? If I can't lose everything to pull this off, to like get out of here, what is an acceptable amount of risk that I will take? And for me, I was 22 and like didn't have college loans. So it was a lot easier for me to go try to be a poor, starving artist in New York. But if I did have college loans, I don't think I would be out. at least it would have taken me a long time to try to get out.
Does that analysis make you hopeful or less hopeful for a democratic republic like ours?
It hangs in the balance for me. I was once able to predict where everything is going, and I was really, really, really good at it. I think this is the first time I can't really tell what the majority of Americans will do and what is going to be like how many people are going to be motivated to vote one way versus the other. I think the numbers are starting to shake out pretty badly for Biden, in that there seems to be a package that he's selling that more and more Americans are not buying for a really fundamental reason. Like either like supporting Israel for progressives is like horrific to them and they cannot support who they view as a genocidal maniac. If you're a conservative, you're like, oh my God, he's pushing this trans agenda and this LGBT agenda. Our kids won't be able to get these jobs in corporate America because of DEI. They won't be able to go to Harvard because of diversity things. And Trump, even if he is not actively selling something that the progressives will accept, he has memory hold himself effectively enough to make them think that Trump is okay in comparison. Like young people are like 21-year-olds who can vote now, no, 18-year-olds who can vote now were what, 14 during the Trump years? Do you think they remember?
If you can't remember January 6th and understand the truth of it, you should probably take yourself to school on it. Tina, congratulations on a great book. It's a great read. It's a rollicking read. Where it ends, we don't know yet, but it's good talking with you. Be well. Congratulations.
Thanks again. Good to talk to you.
Here.